By the time the neighbors came looking for Miriam Calder, her house had already vanished. Not burned, not collapsed, vanished. From the north ridge, where any normal cabin would have shown its square shoulders against the snow, there was only a low mound of prairie grass and packed white drift, with two black stone vents breathing thin threads of vapor into the February air. Jonas Pike saw it first and reined his horse back so sharply the animal sidestepped. 3 days earlier, that place had held a cabin, a door, a chimney, 2 small windows, a roof that made a sound like a drum whenever the Dakota wind hit it wrong. Now, the roof line was gone. The walls were gone. Even the chimney seemed to have crouched down into the earth, and from inside that buried mound came the faintest, impossible thing. A child's laugh. That was when Jonas understood he had not ridden out to collect a widow's body. He had ridden out to see a house the blizzard could not find. 6 months earlier, everyone along Bitter Root Draw had believed Miriam Calder had begun digging her own grave. They did not say it that plainly at first. Frontier people had a talent for turning fear into practical language. They said the widow was overworking. They said grief had made her unreasonable. They said a woman alone with a shovel can convince herself of nearly anything if no one stops her in time. But by the second week of September, when the trench around the north wall of her cabin reached 5 feet deep and wide enough for a man to stand in with a shovel across his shoulders, people stopped softening it. Jonas Pike said it at the feed store. She is burying herself before winter gets the chance. No one laughed, because it did not sound like a joke. Miriam heard the words 2 days later from Ruth Bell, who delivered them with kindness, and with the unhappy pride of someone passing along news she had promised herself not to pass along. Miriam only nodded, because from the outside it did look like burial. She had cut into the earth along the north wall first, then the west, then half the east. She had stacked the removed soil in measured banks instead of careless piles. She had sliced sod from the prairie in flat squares and laid them root down beneath a canvas sheet, as if she were saving pieces of a living roof. By lantern light, she wrote figures on the backs of old flour bills. 32 inches of packed clay against the north wall, 20 inches over the roof, a dogleg entry lower than the floor by 18 inches, so heavy cold air would settle where it could do the least harm. 2 stone-lined air throats, one low, one high, with the upper one set near the stove corner and capped in a way that would shed snow without swallowing the wind. The neighbors saw the hole. They did not see the arithmetic. They saw a woman digging. They did not see a woman moving the battlefield. Miriam had learned too late that the wind wins any fight conducted above ground. The lesson had cost her a husband and a child. The previous January, the Blue Norther came down Bitter Root Draw without the courtesy of warning. It arrived after sundown with the kind of cold that does not feel like temperature so much as theft. Her husband Caleb had gone for the last armload of cottonwood because the stove had eaten through their pile faster than either of them wanted to admit. The wood lean-to stood only 37 paces from the door. Miriam knew the number because she counted it afterward. Not once, not twice, many times, until the number had worn a groove in her mind. 37 paces out, 37 paces back, 74 paces between a living man and a warm room. Caleb made 61 of them. She found him the next morning with one mitten torn loose and his face turned away from the wind. Less than 20 feet from the door he could no longer see. Their daughter Willa lasted 9 more days. The fever had already been in her lungs before the storm came, but the cold finished what sickness had begun. Miriam burned the wood Caleb died bringing in. She hung quilts over the north wall. She kept the stove red enough to make the iron complain. Still, the logs inside the cabin pulled warmth out of the room as if the wall were thirsty for it. On the last night, Miriam pressed her palm against the north wall and understood the truth more clearly than any sermon could have delivered it. She was not heating a home. She was feeding an enemy surface. The wind struck the wall drank the fire. The fire demanded wood. The wood demanded Caleb. The whole system had been arranged to spend lives against weather and call it normal. After Willa was buried beside her father in ground Miriam had to soften with stove ash and boiling water, Ruth Bell asked if she would go east to her sister. Miriam said she would think on it. She did not think on it. Her sister. Miriam said she would think on it. She did not think on it. She sat in the cabin that night with Caleb's carpenter square on her knees and Willa's red ribbon folded under her thumb. And she made the only promise she still had room to make. If the cold came again, it would have to look somewhere else. The idea did not arrive as a miracle. It arrived from things she had already known and had failed to combine. Her father had been a well digger in Missouri before he became a coffin maker, which meant he understood both earth and consequence. When Miriam was small, he had shown her a spring house built halfway into a bank of limestone. Milk stayed cool there in August. Water jars did not freeze there in January. The room never belonged completely to summer or winter because 3 of its walls belonged to the ground. The wind spends everything fast, he had told her, tapping the stone with his knuckles. Ground saves. You put heat into ground, it keeps account. At 8 years old, Miriam had liked the sentence because it sounded like a riddle. At 42, widowed on a treeless Dakota claim, she finally understood it as instruction. The second instruction came from a prairie dog. Late in March, when the snow crust had begun to sag, but the mornings still cut hard, Miriam crossed the draw to check a line of snares. Near the south bank, she saw vapor lifting from a hole in the frozen earth. At first, she thought some ember had been buried there. Then a prairie dog appeared in the opening, round-eyed and irritated, alive inside a world that had no stove, no chimney, no stacked cottonwood, and no man dying for fuel. Only depth. Only a narrow opening. Only earth thick enough to make weather irrelevant. Miriam stood over that hole for a long time while the little animal disappeared below. By April, she had stopped asking whether to leave. By June, she was measuring. By September, she was digging. Her plan had 3 enemies: water, weight, air. Water would rot a buried cabin if she let soil touch logs directly. So she stripped the outer chinking from the north wall, brushed the logs with hot pine tar and ash, then laid scavenged planks and oiled feed sacks between the timber and the packed clay. Where the roof would meet earth, she planned a layer of planking, tarred canvas, thin gravel, then soil and sod. Weight would kill her faster than cold if the roof failed. The old rafters had been made for snow, not for 20 inches of earth. She needed heavier cross beams, not just sistered boards, and she needed them tied into the side walls instead of trusting the old roof alone. Air was the objection every practical person raised, and Miriam had raised it before they did. A buried room with a stove could become a coffin if it breathed wrong. So the air system became the heart of the design. A lower intake near the entry, stone-lined so incoming air would be tempered by mass before reaching the room. A higher exhaust throat near the warmest corner, so rising air would leave slowly and pull replacement air behind it. Not a draft, not a hole. A circuit. She tested it with lamp smoke in a flour barrel before she cut the first shaft. It worked in the barrel. A barrel was not a winter, she knew that. But every structure on the prairie was a wager. The only question was whether a person understood what they were betting against. On the 8th day of digging, the project nearly ended. Miriam had removed the inner boards along the west wall to inspect the old frame before packing soil against it. Behind the boards, where the sill met the floor, her knife went into wood that should have stopped it. It did not stop. The sill had been hollowed by old damp and frost, not enough to show from the room, but enough that the house she meant to bury was not strong enough to trust. She checked the north corner. Worse. She checked under the stove corner. Worse again. 3 sections of sill had to be replaced. 2 rafters had to come out entirely. She could patch neither, and sleep under earth with any peace. So she opened the tin beneath the loose pantry stone and counted her money. Then she counted it again. The count did not improve by being repeated. New beams from the mill at Red Lantern Crossing would take almost everything. Nails and lamp oil would take most of the rest. If the cow went dry before spring or the hens stopped laying, she would have no margin. If she hurt herself, there would be no hired hand. If the shelter failed, she would have spent the last good money Caleb left on the device that killed her. For an hour, she sat on the floor with the open tin beside her. Then she put the money in her coat and walked outside to hitch the mare. A bad structure does not become safe because the owner is poor. She made the trip in 2 days, brought back oak beams across the wagon bed, and unloaded them alone by rolling one end at a time over fence posts she used as skids. By the time she finished, her shoulder had a dark bruise the size of a man's palm, and her hands would not close properly. She went inside, set Caleb's carpenter square on the table, and spoke aloud for the first time all day. There is no cheaper way to stay alive. Jonas Pike came the following morning. He had a large black beard, a small store of patience, and the unfortunate habit of mistaking both for wisdom. He stood at the edge of the trench and looked down at Miriam as if the dirt between them were already the difference between the living and the dead. "Mrs. Calder," he said, "a house belongs above the ground." "So does a man," Miriam answered. "It did not save Caleb." Jonas looked away. She regretted the cruelty, but not enough to take it back. He cleared his throat. "You pack earth against those walls, damp will eat them. You load that roof, it will break. You shut yourself in there, air will turn on you." "Those are the right problems," she said. That stopped him. Miriam climbed out and answered each one. She showed him the tarred barrier. The drainage trench sloped away from the walls, the gravel layer under the roof soil, the new beams waiting beside the entry, the lower and upper air throats marked in chalk. She showed him the smoke test in the flour barrel, which he pretended not to find interesting. When she finished, Jonas had the expression of a man who had come to call something foolish and been forced to learn the shape of the foolishness first. "It is still too much work for one woman," he said. "That may be true. And if you miss one thing, winter will show you." "Winter already showed me." He had no answer to that. For 3 weeks, Bitterroot Draw watched her disappear the cabin inch by inch. The roofline dropped first, not physically, visually. As she packed the side banks and shaped the roof soil, the cabin stopped looking like a building and began looking like something the prairie had raised in its sleep. From the north, there was nothing for the wind to catch except a gradual slope. From the west, the worst direction for storms, the wall was no longer a wall. It was ground. Ruth Bell understood before most of them, not because she had Miriam's figures, but because she came one afternoon carrying a basket of eggs, and found the shelter holding warmth from a test fire that had burned out hours earlier. Ruth's son Tom was 9 years old and had a mind that ran ahead of his manners. He walked the entry slope twice, crouched beside the lower air throat, and pressed his cheek to the north wall. "It is like a fox den," he said. Miriam looked at him. Then she looked at Ruth. Ruth gave the smallest shrug, as if to say, children often arrive at the truth without asking permission. "Yes," Miriam said, "a fox does not argue with weather. It chooses a better place to be." Tom thought about that for so long, the room became quiet. "Then why do we build houses like boxes?" Miriam had no clean answer. Because boards are easier to count than wind. Because people trust what they can see. Because every family on the prairie had learned from some other family, and nobody wanted to be the first to admit the pattern itself might be wrong. Instead, she said, because most lessons wait for a bill before they teach. The first proof came in November. Miriam built a small fire at dawn, no larger than what she used to call kindling. She expected the room to warm slowly, perhaps not enough, perhaps only by mercy of the mild weather. Within an hour, she removed her coat. By noon, the fire had gone out, and the room did not collapse back into cold. The stone hearth held heat. The packed earth behind the walls held it more quietly. The air felt not warm exactly, but kept. That was the word that came to her. Kept. For 2 winters, she had lived in a room that had to be saved every hour. Now she sat in a room that saved back. She learned new habits by failing at the old ones. The first week of December, she built too much fire and made the shelter stifling. She opened the inner door and wasted heat like a beginner. After that, she reduced everything. 1 armload in the morning, 1 stick in the evening, 2 if the night looked bitter. By Christmas, the wood stack in the entry had shrunk so little that she counted it twice because her mind mistrusted the evidence. The second proof came less gently. On December 18th, she woke with a heaviness in the air. The fire was low. The room was steady. Nothing looked dangerous. But when she held a thread near the lower intake, it moved. When she held the same thread near the upper throat, it hung dead. The circuit had stopped. She took a lantern outside and found the upper vent capped, not by snow, but by ice. Wind had driven wet crystals under the stone lip during a thaw, and the night's freeze had sealed them into a smooth, clear plug. It was not dramatic. It was only an inch of ice. An inch of ice could kill a sleeping woman as surely as a blizzard. She cleared it with a stove poker, widened the cap gap on the leeward side, and added a wire screen made from a broken sieve. Then she went inside and watched the thread lift toward the upper throat again. From that day on, she checked both vents every morning. A system does not have to be wrong to be dangerous. Sometimes it only has to be neglected. By January, Jonas Pike had stopped using the word grave. He came during a hard cold that froze pump handles inside barns and made horses stand with their tails to the wind. He entered Miriam's shelter with frost on his beard and argument still arranged on his face. Then he looked at her fire. It was small enough to shame him. He looked at the wood stack. It was still more than half of what she had stored in November. He removed 1 glove and pressed his palm against the buried north wall. He kept it there. Miriam watched his face change in the smallest possible way. The wall was cool. Not cold, not hungry, not the iron thing that had taken warmth faster than she could make it. Jonas crossed to the west wall and tested that too. Finally, he said, had taken warmth faster than she could make it. Jonas crossed to the west wall and tested that too. Finally, he said, "My stove is twice that size." "I remember. And I am burning 3 times the wood." "I expect you are." He took his hand from the wall as if the wall had answered him and he disliked the answer. "It works," he said. Miriam waited. Jonas was not a man who apologized quickly. He had to approach humility from a distance, as if it might kick. "I was wrong about the grave," he said at last. That was enough. He stood another moment, studying the entry slope, the air throats, the low roof, the way the room seemed to sit inside the ground instead of under it. Then he said, "I have a calf shed taking the north wind. If I bank earth against it, what do I do first?" Miriam showed him, not because he had earned it, because cattle were alive, and because being right is a smaller satisfaction than seeing a dangerous mistake corrected before it charges someone else. The storm that made the shelter famous came on February 6, 1888. Miriam knew before noon. The sky to the northwest turned the color of old pewter with a yellow seam beneath it. The wind died, which was worse than wind. Animals vanished from the open ground. The air felt as if it were waiting for permission. She moved every stick of wood from the outside rack into the entry. She filled crocks with water and set them under the bench. She brought the hens into a crate near the lower turn of the tunnel where they would be cold but safe. She checked the vent caps twice, then a third time, because survival often belongs to the person willing to look foolish in front of no one. By late afternoon, the first ice struck the window well. By dusk, the world above the shelter no longer sounded like a world. It sounded like a millstone turning. Miriam sat beside the stove with one small stick on the coals and Caleb's carpenter's square on the table. She did not keep it there for luck. Luck was too soft a word. She kept it there because the square reminded her that feeling and measurement did not have to be enemies. The wind took the surface. The ground kept the room. For 6 hours, nothing happened. That was the miracle, if the story had one. Not a rescue. Not a flash of divine light. Not a roof torn away and restored by Providence. Nothing happened. The walls held. The vents breathed. The fire asked for almost nothing. The room remained steady while the storm searched every exposed thing in the draw and found no corner on Miriam's house where it could begin its work. Near midnight, she heard a sound that did not belong to the storm. At first, it seemed like a flaw in the wind's voice. Then it came again, a thin cry, torn into pieces. Miriam stood without thinking and took down the rope from its peg. She had fixed an iron ring into the stone of the entry in October. No one had asked why. She had not volunteered the explanation. There are preparations that sound sensible only after the day they are needed. She tied the rope to the ring, wrapped the free end around her waist, and opened the outer door. The storm hit like a thrown board. Snow struck her eyes and took the shape of the world away. She moved by the rope and by memory, counting steps toward the bell place, because the cry came from that direction, low and broken under the wind. 12 steps. 18. 23. The rope went tight for a moment against a buried drift, then freed. At 31 steps, her boot struck something soft that moved. Tom Bell was curled against the lee side of a fence brace, with his hands tucked under his arms and his face hidden in his coat. He had come to return Caleb's draw knife, he told her later, because children understand obligation more fiercely than weather. In the storm, he said nothing. Miriam dropped to her knees, got one arm under him, and put her mouth close to his ear. "Tom, rope, hold me." He held. The return took longer than the search. The wind was behind them now, which should have helped, but it filled every gap in her clothing and drove snow under her collar with the precision of a knife. Tom stumbled twice. The second time she dragged him 3 steps before he found his feet again. Then her boot struck stone. The entry cut swallowed them. 1 step below the surface, the storm's voice broke in half. 2 steps lower, it became something outside. Inside, she barred the door and pulled Tom's mittens off. His fingers were red and waxy at the tips, but they bent. She wrapped his hands in her own and rubbed until he cried from pain, which was the best sound available. She fed him beans and cornbread before she let him sleep. He asked only one question before exhaustion took him. "Will Pa know I am here?" Miriam looked at the door. Beyond it, the storm was no longer weather a person entered by choice. Ruth Bell and her husband would not know. They might guess, they might pray, they might imagine every ditch between their place and hers until morning destroyed them with possibilities. "I will keep you here," Miriam said. "That is the thing I can do." Tom accepted the answer because sleep had already claimed most of him. On the second night, the knocking began. 3 strikes, a pause, 3 strikes. Miriam came awake on the floor beside the stove, instantly certain she was not hearing wind. Wind scraped, wind moaned, wind pressed and withdrew. This sound had a hand in it. 3 strikes, a pause, 3 strikes. Not at the door, above. She crossed to the upper air throat and stood beneath it with the lamp lifted. Someone was on top of the shelter, in the storm, striking the stone cap. Ruth's husband, Elias Bell, had found the only part of Miriam's vanished house that still touched the outside world. She could imagine him belly down in the drift, face wrapped, one hand against the vent stones, knocking because he could not reach the door, could not see the window, could not know whether his boy lay frozen in the draw or asleep under the ground. Miriam struck the stone throat from inside, 3 times. The answer came so fast it felt like a sob through rock. 3 from above. She put her mouth to the throat and shouted upward. "He is here! He is warm! He is alive!" She could not know if the words traveled, so she knocked again, 3 times. This time the answer from above came slower, 3, then no more. She sat beneath the vent long after, listening to Tom breathe near the stove, and to the storm spend itself against a house it could not enter. She thought of Elias, crawling back through that white violence, carrying only 3 knocks as proof. It was not much. It was enough to keep a father moving. The storm lasted 2 days and most of a third. When silence returned, Miriam did not trust it at first. Silence after great wind can feel like another trick. She lay still and took inventory. Air moving, coals alive, room cool but safe, child breathing. Then she dug out. The outer door was sealed by packed snow dense enough to cut in blocks. She worked in the entry with short strokes of the shovel until daylight came through in a blue blade. When she widened the hole and climbed onto the roof of her own house, the valley had been remade. Fences vanished under drifts. The pike barn leaned at one corner, its north wall stove in where wind had found a seam and worked on it for hours. Smoke poured black from several chimneys, the color of stoves being driven hard by people who had spent 3 days losing heat and feeding the loss with wood. At the Bell place, the calf shed stood. The north bank Elias had built after Jonas repeated Miriam's advice had taken the weather and given little back. The house smoked lightly. No animals lay dark against the snow near the fence. Then Miriam looked down. Her shelter was only a mound. Snow had crossed it the way snow crosses a natural hill. The wind had spent its strength on higher things. It had built a drift beyond the draw where the land rose, because that was the first real wall it found. Her house had offered no argument. The wind had gone looking for one. Tom climbed out behind her, blinking at the bright ruin of the morning. His hair stood up in wild angles, and his face carried the stunned pride of a child who had survived something large enough to become part of him. He turned and looked at the mound under their feet. "If a stranger rode by," he said, "he would not know your house was here." "No." "Is that why it lived?" Miriam considered the question. A child had asked her months earlier why people built houses like boxes. This was the other half of that question, arriving after proof. "A storm needs a surface," she said. "Give it a wall, and it spends all night trying to take the wall. Give it a roof edge, and it pries. Give it a crack, and it becomes patient." Tom looked at the white ground. "And if you give it nothing?" "Then it passes on and troubles something else." Elias Bell came at mid-morning. He did not ride. No horse could manage the drifts. He came on snowshoes, staggering with exhaustion, his beard frozen into points, his eyes fixed on Tom until he had both hands on the boy's shoulders. He did not speak at first. Then he looked at Miriam, and whatever thanks he had prepared failed him. So he pressed his palm against the snow-covered roof of the shelter, the way a man might touch the shoulder of an animal that had carried his child home. Under the snow, under sod, under packed earth and tarred planks and new beams bought with the last of Caleb's money, the room still held its small, steady warmth. Elias felt it. He closed his eyes. After that winter, no one along Bitter Root Draw called Miriam Calder's shelter a grave. Jonas banked the north side of his calf shed before March thaw. Elias rebuilt his west wall into a half-buried lean with a dog-leg door. Ruth Bell asked Miriam to mark the air-throat dimensions on a flour sack and kept the sack folded in her Bible, because it was the only paper in the house no one would throw away. Not every attempt worked. One man packed soil against green cottonwood and trapped rot. Another built an entry too straight and complained of drafts, until Miriam told him cold air, like water, follows the easiest path you give it. A third tried to bury a roof without changing the beams, and was saved only because the first sag appeared before the spring rain. But the idea did not leave. By the winter of 1892, 6 earth-banked shelters stood along the draw. By 1895, 2 barns had been cut into low hillsides and kept calves through cold that would have killed them in the old sheds. Wood piles lasted longer. Women slept more. Men stopped walking in the whiteout for fuel they should never have needed so desperately in the first place. Miriam did not become famous in the way newspapers understand fame. There was no statue, no patent, no lecture hall with her name spoken by men in clean collars. Her proof lived in smaller records: a cord of cottonwood not burned, a child who grew up, a calf crop that did not freeze, a widow who stopped waking every 2 hours to feed a stove like an altar to a God that never answered. Years later, when Tom Bell was a grown man with sons of his own, a county paper printed a short item about the old earth houses of Bitter Root Draw. The reporter called them quaint, which made Tom laugh so sharply his youngest boy looked up from the table. "Quaint," Tom said, folding the paper. "What is funny?" Tom looked toward the low mound behind his own house, where a stone vent gave off a white thread in the January dusk. He could still remember being 9 years old, half frozen at a fence brace, then waking under the ground beside a fire that barely seemed large enough to matter. He could remember 3 knocks coming down through stone. He could remember Miriam Calder standing on the white roof of her vanished house, explaining that wind needs a surface. It was not quaint, he told his son. It was the first sensible house this draw ever had. The boy looked at the mound again, and this time his eyes changed. The shape behind the house stopped being scenery. It became an answer he had been living beside without understanding. "Who taught you?" the boy asked. Tom set the newspaper down. "A woman who lost everything above ground," he said, and learned the ground had been keeping score the whole time. Outside, the wind moved across the prairie with its old hunger, searching for corners, seams, and upright walls. At Miriam Calder's house, it found only earth and went on.